Hello there, it's
Your favorite chaplain.
coming at you once again. And if you remember, I started a series called Getting God's Attention, and I'm going to finish that series today. I believe we get God's attention when we step out in faith, when we respond to his calling. And last week, I mentioned some of the ways that God may call you. I mentioned that sometimes he does lay out the entire plan in advance and make it as clear and easy to follow as possible. Then sometimes he just gives you a little bit of direction, like he did with Moses. He just said, go. And then, of course, sometimes he may just present the opportunity, or you might find yourself in an opportunity where you know what you should do as a Christian. And then you also might have to just wait patiently and trust that God will call you or show you more details in his timing. And all of those ways are things that we should be recognizing and looking for when we're thinking about stepping into the vision and the calling that God has for our lives. So I hope you're still thinking about taking steps of faith, whether they're baby steps or large leaps, and understanding what the vision and calling is for your life. Last week, I just briefly mentioned a little bit about Elisha and how he was just seemingly like randomly chosen while he was out there plowing his field, that Elijah came up and put the mantle. Now we know God had told Elijah to go to Elisha, but there's nothing more about Elisha before this. He was just doing his job, and all of a sudden the calling came upon him. And of course, he immediately obeyed and followed that calling. So I'm going to wrap up the series by talking a little bit more about the journey that Elisha took with Elijah. I hope you'll enjoy it.
Welcome to Atypical Church.
Okay, so once Elisha accepted this calling and left his family to follow Elijah, there's a really interesting journey that begins. Now, he was Elijah's servant, so he would have definitely heard some of the amazing stories that Elijah had experienced, probably a lot of the tough things that Elijah had to go through before he saw God do these amazing things. Elijah would have very likely told Elisha about what happened when he was interacting with the evil king Ahab and his wife Jezebel, and then God poured down fire from heaven to consume the altar and the sacrifice. And then, of course, Elijah prayed that God would open the rains to end the 3.5 drought, and that happened. So I'm sure there must have been some pretty amazing dialogue between the two of them as they're on this journey. So I covered a lot of this in a previous series called Holding On to Hope. That was actually in June of 2020. But I can't help but go over some of this again and kind of revamp it a bit because it's such a good story for this specific message. So starting off, we see in 2 Kings 2, verses 1 to 2, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. So I love that response. I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stick around. I want to listen to everything you say and see everything that you do and that God does in you. And I want to just soak this up until you're taken away. And I'm sure Elisha knew that, pretty soon he would be replacing Elijah, and he better be ready. So why did they go to Bethel? I think that's a really neat question to ask, because if you know the history of Bethel, these are the things that would have been going through Elisha's mind. So, in particular, we know that God's people would go to Bethel as a place of worship. And we also know that the Ark of the Covenant rested in Bethel for quite some time. We read about that in the book of Judges. We also know that this is where Jacob had his famous dream where he saw the ladder going up to heaven, and then God reaffirmed the promise that he had given to Jacob's father Abraham about them being the father of many nations. And God was kind of confirming that promise through Jacob to say that it's through your line that I will continue this. And what's cool about that story is Jacob built an altar there. And I can't say for sure that Elisha would have seen the altar, but regardless of that, Elisha and Elijah were standing in the presence of this area where God had done amazing things, where people would have gone to worship. And I believe that this was just an opportunity for Elisha to remember God's promises, that he would have been reminded of those amazing things that God said to the forefathers and that God was already doing. And I'm sure that would have given him some strength and courage to keep moving in his journey. And I believe God was teaching Elisha about his sovereignty. So we continue on with 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 4. It says, "Then Elijah said to him, 'Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho.' And he replied, 'As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you.' So they went to Jericho." So why would they go to Jericho? Now we know throughout Bible this was also a very important city. We know that previously Joshua had led the exiled Israelites on their journey through the desert to get to the promised land, and they got to Jericho. And that was supposed to be the entry into their promised land. And unfortunately, it was tightly shut up. There were walls built all around the city. It was inhabited. So, if God had promised me something and then I get there and it doesn't look like what I expect, I might be tempted to be like, really, God? Is this, am I in the right place? Is this the right time? Like, what's going on here? But what's interesting about that story, if you don't know it, you can read about it in Joshua chapter 6. But Joshua led the Israelites to march around the city and to just declare the praises of God. And of course, we read in verse 20, "When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city." Now, again, I can't be certain exactly what Elisha would have seen at that time, but he would have seen a city and an area where people would have inhabited this place as the promised land. And I believe in Jericho, God was teaching Elisha of his triumphant nature, that God will triumph over any obstacle that you might have. And then finally, we get to 2 Kings 2, verse 6, where it says, "Then Elijah said to him, 'Stay here, the Lord has sent me to the Jordan.' And he replied, 'As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you.' So the two of them walked on." So again, why did they go to the Jordan River? Now, once again, just approaching the river would have reminded Elisha of some of the stories of old, of God intervening when there seemed to be no way. And going back to the previous story of Joshua leading the Israelites, we know that Joshua and Caleb, in order to get to Jericho, they had to cross the Jordan River, and you can't just walk over it. So God parted the river for them. And Elisha must have known that and wondered, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to cross this? Is God going to part the river for us as well? And of course, if you read the next few verses, Elijah proceeds to part the river. Well, it's obviously God through Elijah. So they get to the other side. And that's where God takes Elijah up into heaven. And then Elisha has to go back across the river and has to have it parted again. So he is finding himself in a place where he has to just completely trust God to part this river. And not for Elijah this time, but for himself. And I can't help but think of this as kind of like a final exam. He saw God do it for Elijah, and now it was time for him to see if God would do it for him. And of course, he did. And I believe Elisha was reminded that God will make that way when there seems to be no way. God will open a door. And if he has given you a calling, if he has a plan for your life, he is going to make a way. He is going to open doors for you. He's going to give you wisdom and guidance, and he's going to teach you through the experience. So, a few things that I'd like you to take away from this message. First of all, we need to remember God's promises. When Elisha was in Bethel, he would have remembered. It actually was called Bethel because Jacob changed the name from Luz to Bethel when God interacted with him. So that would just be an amazing experience to remember God's promises. And secondly, we need to remember that God will triumph, and we will triumph when we follow God's guidance. When we ask Him for wisdom and when we follow His direction, we will triumph because God is going before us in the battle. And finally, just like Elisha would have seen and been reminded of God making a way when there seemed to be no way, when He parted the Jordan River, God will make a way for you when there seems to be no way. So it's important that we're just praying in accordance with God's will. We're asking Him to strengthen our faith so that we can be obedient, and we're walking through the doors that He opens for us, trusting that He knows what He's doing. So I hope this has encouraged you. God bless you.